Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into Arcane again today, but with a bit of a twist.
Yeah, this time we're not just talking about the show itself, but like what it can teach us about the real world.
Exactly. So we've got this fascinating academic analysis, power and corruption in Arcane. And it really digs into those themes, how power dynamics play out in the show.
More importantly, how those dynamics reflect real-world power struggles.
Totally. So, like, if you're interested in how societies work or how power shapes the world around us.
This is the deep dive for you.
For sure. Okay, so the analysis starts with this really interesting premise. It argues that power, like in itself, isn't inherently good or evil.
It's more like a tool, right?
Yeah, like a tool that can be used for good or for ill.
And they use tons of examples from history to show how even innovations that were meant to help people
Can end up being used to control and dominate them.
Exactly.
That immediately made me think about hex tech in Arcane. It has this incredible potential to improve lives, but it also becomes a tool for the elite in Piltover.
Oh, absolutely. To maintain their authority over Zaun.
Yeah. It's a brilliant parallel to how technology is developing in our own world, right?
Right. I mean, think about the internet. It was supposed to democratize information and connect people, but it's also...
Oh, tell me about it. It's become a breeding ground for misinformation and surveillance. And the concentration of power.
in the hands of a few tech giants.
All right.
It's like those in power, they always figure out how to adapt and use new tools to stay on top.
Even if those tools were originally intended to make things more equal.
Exactly. But the analysis goes beyond just technology. They also delve into the psychology of power, like how power can warp even the best intentions.
Oh, for sure. And they use Jace as a perfect example. Remember in the beginning, he's this idealistic inventor.
Oh, totally. He wants to use Hextech to make the world a better place.
Exactly. I was totally rooting for him at first. He seems so passionate about using science for good. But then, as he climbs the ranks in Piltover...
He gets caught up in the political machine.
Yeah, and he starts making compromises that, well...
don't quite align with his initial goals.
to put it mildly.
Right. And the analysis argues that this is a classic example of how power can erode idealism.
It forces people to make tough choices that often have a moral cost. It's like that saying, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good one. But it's not always that black and white, is it?
That's a good point. The analysis also points out that even people who reject power can sometimes unintentionally contribute to the problem.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, take Vander, for example. He chose to step back from violence and focus on protecting his community through peace. But in a way, didn't that decision create a void?
A void that allowed someone like Silco to rise to power.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. And the analysis touches on that. They compare Vander to figures like Nelson Mandela, who chose peace and forgiveness after experiencing oppression. But they argue that those figures sometimes leave a space.
For less scrupulous people to step in.
Yeah, it's a complex dilemma, that's for sure.
Yeah.
No easy answers.
Definitely makes you think about the responsibility that comes with power, even if it's not something you actively pursued.
Absolutely. And it highlights the fact that power isn't just about individual choices. It's about the systems that we create and perpetuate.
Which brings us to the whole dynamic between Piltover and Zaun. I mean, it's clear from the show that Piltover is exploiting Zaun.
Using them for their own gain.
Right. But the analysis goes deeper, exploring how those systems of oppression came to be.
Yeah, they trace it back, don't they? Historically.
They do. And they argue that Piltover's reliance on hex tech, while meant for progress, actually mirrors other instances in history.
Where technological advancements ended up widening the wealth gap.
Exactly. They draw parallels to the work of scholars like...
Name of scholar, who argue that technology often reinforces existing power structures.
instead of dismantling them.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting, because the analysis challenges the idea that Zaun is just a victim.
Oh, interesting.
They point out that even within Zaun, there are people who are vying for power and control.
Using the same tactics as their oppressors.
Often, yeah. Silco is a perfect example. He's a product of Piltover's oppression, and he's driven by this desire to liberate Zaun.
But his methods, the violence, the manipulation, the shimmer, they all mirror what he's supposedly fighting against.
Right. It's like the
Twisted reflection.
Yeah, exactly. He becomes a twisted reflection of the system he's trying to overthrow.
It's easy to get caught up in his charisma and his vision for Zaun.
Right. You think he's a good guy at first, but then...
You see how he uses Jinx.
Yeah.
And it makes you question everything.
Absolutely. And the analysis brings up this idea that power is often cyclical. Those who fight against oppression can become the oppressors themselves.
If they're not careful.
Yeah. It's a cautionary tale that we see throughout history and across cultures.
Wow. So we've got power as a double-edged sword, the corrupting influence of good intentions, and this cyclical nature of oppression.
It's pretty intense.
It is. And it's clear that this analysis goes way beyond just summarizing the show.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's about making connections between Arcane and the real world, understanding the complexities of power.
And maybe learning from the mistakes of these characters so we can make better choices in our own lives.
Exactly.
So we've talked about these big, power systems, but the analysis also looks at how these systems impact individuals. And it's kind of heartbreaking, honestly.
Oh yeah. Arcane is really good at showing how those power struggles, whether it's in society or just between people, can really mess people up. And the analysis uses different characters to illustrate this point. And Jinx is a prime example.
Her story is just, it's so tragic. You see her go from this innocent kid, Powder, to this, agent of chaos. And the analysis argues that she's not just a product of her own trauma, but also a victim of how adults in power manipulate vulnerable people.
Yeah, and they actually connect Jinx's story to real-world examples of child soldiers, showing how adults use young people's pain and turn them into weapons.
It's messed up, and it makes me think about that point the analysis made earlier about how power can corrupt even those who think they're liberators. I mean, Silco clearly thinks he's doing what's best for Zaun.
Right, he has that whole savior complex.
Yeah. But the way he manipulates Jinx is just, it's chilling.
It's a disturbing paradox, right? He's fighting for Zaun's freedom, but he ends up using the same tactics of exploitation and control as his oppressors.
Totally. It's like he's trapped in this cycle of abuse.
And that's why the analysis encourages us to look beyond just the surface, to really examine how power works, even in people who seem like heroes.
Yeah, because it's not always obvious.
They use this term benevolent paternalism to describe Silco's relationship with Jinx, showing how even acts of kindness can be a form of manipulation.
So even good intentions can be twisted.
Exactly.
And Jinx isn't the only character who gets caught in the crossfire, right?
Yeah.
The analysis also points to Caitlyn as an interesting case study. She comes from a privileged background in Piltover, but she starts to see the cracks in the system.
Right, she becomes disillusioned with the whole thing.
And the analysis argues that she represents a crucial element: internal dissent. Even within these oppressive systems, you have people who are pushing for change.
Yeah, they're not just going along with it. And they point out that Caitlyn's partnership with V, who's from Zaun, shows how powerful it can be to bridge those divides.
I love their dynamic. They come from completely different worlds, but they both want justice.
Yeah. And the analysis suggests that real change can't come from just one side or the other. It takes a willingness to work together and break down those barriers.
That's what Caitlyn and V are trying to do. And the analysis really highlights how their partnership shakes things up.
They're not bound by the traditional power structures of either Piltover or Zaun, so they're able to see things from a fresh perspective and challenge the status quo.
They offer a glimmer of hope in this, pretty messed up situation.
Exactly. But the analysis reminds us that even those who try to work within the system can get sucked in. Like Marcus, the enforcer captain.
Oh yeah, he's like the poster child for how everyday corruption can wear you down.
He starts out as this seemingly decent guy, but he ends up betraying his morals for his own gain.
That's a slippery slope.
The analysis uses Marcus to illustrate this idea of incremental corruption, where it's not about these big evil acts.
It's more about the little compromises we make along the way.
Right, and it's scary because it's so relatable.
Oh, totally. I mean, haven't we all been tempted to bend the rules sometimes?
For sure. And the analysis suggests that we need to be more aware of those moments.
Because those seemingly small choices can contribute to much bigger problems.
Exactly. So we've got Jinx as a victim of exploitation, Caitlyn as a symbol of hope and resistance, and Marcus as a cautionary tale.
It's amazing how the analysis uses these characters to show how power operates on a personal level, but it goes beyond just individual stories, right?
Absolutely. They connect those struggles to the larger systemic issues at play.
Like the whole Piltover Zaun dynamic.
Yeah, they argue that those power dynamics shade everything. They create the conditions for exploitation, corruption, and violence.
And that's where the analysis pushes us to think about power not just as something that individuals hold, but as something embedded in our systems.
They're saying we need to look beyond just individual villains.
And examine the systems that create them.
Exactly. Like even if you remove someone like Silco, another Silco would just pop up.
Because the system itself is set up to create those power imbalances.
Right. It's a pretty sobering thought. It means that real change needs a much bigger shift, than just replacing one bad guy with another.
So what's the solution then? Is there even a way out of this power corrupts everything scenario?
Well, the analysis does offer some potential solutions, or at least starting points. They emphasize awareness, for one thing.
Like recognizing how power is operating around us.
Exactly. We need to be able to spot those red flags, the ways people try to manipulate or control others. And we need to be willing to call it out.
Even if it makes people uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And the analysis also highlights the importance of challenging the status quo.
Like what Caitlin and Vi are doing.
Right. They're willing to push back against those in power, to fight for what they believe in. And the analysis argues that we need more of that.
More people willing to stand up for what's right.
Yes. But they also face a lot of resistance, right?
Oh, absolutely. Changing the system isn't easy.
And that's where the analysis brings up this idea of collective action. Real, lasting change requires more than just a few individuals.
It takes a movement.
Yeah. A collective effort to challenge those in power and demand a more just and equitable society.
And that can take many forms, right? Like protests, organizing, voting.
Even just having conversations about these issues, raising awareness. Exactly. The analysis stresses that even small acts of resistance can contribute to bigger change.
It's like that quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
That's a good one. And I think that's such a powerful message, especially when things feel overwhelming. It reminds us that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
That even small acts of resistance can make a difference. Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this deep dive into power and corruption in Arcane. How power can be used for good or bad, how even with good intentions things can go wrong, and how the systems themselves can, breed corruption. But before we wrap up, I'm curious about something. The analysis keeps mentioning these unintended consequences. Is it even possible to, wield power without causing some kind of harm?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of what makes this analysis so thought-provoking, They argue that power is just inherently messy, unpredictable. It's not always about bad intentions. Sometimes, even when you're trying to do good.
You end up causing harm.
Yeah. And they point to Jace as an example. He really wants to make the world a better place, but his actions end up contributing to the oppression of Zaun.
Even though that wasn't his goal.
Right. His heart was in the right place, but the consequences were still negative. And the analysis uses this to show that good intentions aren't enough.
We need to think about the potential consequences of our actions, even when we're trying to do the right thing.
Exactly.
It makes you think about all those policies in the real world that are meant to help people.
But they end up backfiring.
Yeah, exactly.
So the analysis suggests we need to approach power with a lot of humility. Recognizing that we don't always have the answers and our actions can have ripple effects we don't anticipate.
So what can we do then? If power is so messy and unpredictable, how do we navigate this whole thing without making things worse?
Well, the analysis offers a few insights.
Yeah.
First, they emphasize critical thinking. We need to constantly question our assumptions, be aware of our biases and consider different points of view.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. We need to be willing to challenge our own beliefs and admit we might be wrong sometimes.
That's hard.
It is. And that leads to their second point, the importance of dialogue and collaboration. We need to listen to people who disagree with us, get different perspectives, and work together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
Kind of like what Caitlin and Vey are trying to do.
Yeah. They're a great example of how collaboration can disrupt those old power structures. And the analysis says we need more of that kind of collaboration in the real world if we want to solve these big, complex problems.
Right. But even Caitlin and Vey face pushback, even from people who are supposedly on their side.
Yeah, changing things is never easy.
And that brings us to the third takeaway from the analysis. Perseverance. This fight for a more just and equitable world, it's a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks, disappointments, times when it feels like nothing is changing.
So we need to be in it for the long haul.
Yeah. We have to keep fighting for what we believe in, even when it's tough. And ultimately, I think that's the hopeful message of the analysis. We're not powerless. Even in a world where power can be so easily misused, we still have choices. We can challenge injustice, and we can work towards a better future.
Exactly.
That's a great note to end on. So as we come up for air from our deep dive into power and corruption in Arcane, I hope you're thinking about all the complexities we've uncovered, but also about the potential we all have to make a positive impact, however small.
Power isn't just about controlling others, it's also about empowering ourselves and each other to build a better world.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Catch you next time.